of the road, the women on the left. Eventually it was decided that enough was enough. Someone offered the chief minister a bribe of 80 beautiful young girls to get rid of Confucius. The chief minister, who had not had the benefit of a Confucian education, found himself unable to refuse this exhaustively challenging offer. Confucius was relieved of his post. The men and women of Lu reverted to walking on the same pavement, and began wearing fashionable clothes they wouldn't be seen dead in, and criminals were able to retire from unsuitable employment in order to follow their true calling. In recognition of his services, Confucius was offered promotion to an even more prestigious post with a highly impressive title and salary. But he quickly discovered that this was a mere sinecure with no authority whatsoever. He resigned at once in disgust. He wasn't interested in the job if he didn't have the power to decide important matters of state. Confucius was now over 50 years old. He decided to set out, accompanied by a few disciples, on a pilgrimage around China, but this was not a pilgrimage in the usual spiritual sense. It had no holy destination, and Confucius wasn't seeking enlightenment on the way. His pilgrimage, like his philosophy, had wholly secular intentions. He was looking for a job, and if he couldn't find a job, perhaps he could find a future ruler whom he could tutor, so that at last, somewhere, his principles could be put into practice. But word had obviously spread about Confucius. His pilgrimage in search of the holy grail of employment was to last more than 10 years. Occasionally he would be asked for advice, but once again no offers of a permanent job progressed beyond the interview stage. We can only speculate about the reasons for this. Confucius was now generally regarded as the wisest man throughout China. He had taught many of its most able administrators, and he had even held minor office himself, without accepting a single bribe, or even betraying his master to his enemies. Such eccentricity was considered almost perverse, and certainly contributed to the later belief that Confucius was a purely legendary character who had never existed. There was obviously something about Confucius. Earnestness, unwillingness to compromise, unpleasant personal habits, or perhaps just simple halitosis of the soul. We shall never know precisely what it was about him that didn't appeal to the Chinese ruling classes. My own opinion, after studying his writings, is that they may just have found him a colossal bore. Even Confucius's adventures during his decade of travels seem to have acquired this characteristic element of boringness. When he visited the state of Wei, he had a private audience with the ruler's sister, the notorious Nan Tzu, which deeply upset his disciples. But history has prudishly censored whatever it was that so upset Confucius's disciples, and we don't even learn how Nan Tzu achieved her celebrated notoriety, apart from some trivial gossip about royal incest. In the province of Sung, Confucius learned that someone was out to assassinate him, so he took to wearing inconspicuous clothing. And so his prosaic pilgrimage continued. In Sung, he is also said to have met the local ruler, and talked long into the night with him, eventually convincing his host that his ideas on how to rule were worth following. Virtue and competent administration, not personal ambition, were the keys to success. Confucius's crusade had made another conquest. Boredom had once again defeated barbarism, but even this ruler curmudgeonly refused to offer Confucius a job. By now Confucius was 67. His lesser coevals were all happily retired, but he was still trying to get his career started. In the end, Confucius's disciples back in Lu decided that the only answer was to invite their master home again. It was time for this most practical of philosophers, who all his life had preached the virtues of an honest day's work, to abandon forever the idea that he would be able to earn a living. Confucius duly returned home and lived out his last 5 years in Lu. These were sad years. His favorite disciple, Yen Hui, died, and for once in his life Confucius lapsed briefly into despair. "Alas, there is no one who understands me," he told his remaining disciples. He became convinced that his vital message would never reach the generations to come. His son, Liu, also died. Practically nothing is known of Liu's life. He is said to have exhibited no exceptional qualities, but later evidence points against this. Within just a few centuries there were more than 40,000 people in China who claimed to be descended from Confucius, which would seem to indicate exceptional activity by the master's only son. Confucius spent his last years reading, editing, and writing commentaries on the Chinese classics, the canon of works dating from the period when China emerged from antiquity. The Lun Yu, the sayings of Confucius, were to be added to this canon before it was carved in stone in the mid-3rd century BC. The Chinese classics ranged from the sublime Shi, poems, sometimes known as the Book of Songs, which incorporate legendary material with timeless day-to-day details of earliest Chinese life, to the mysterious and much misused I Ching, Book of Changes, an intriguing blend of metaphysical mumbo-jumbo and psychological insight. The latter began life as a book of divination. Like Babylonian astrology, which dates from this same period of humanity's adolescence, it contains an edifice of gnomic wisdom built on the flimsiest of foundations. The I Ching's undeniably esoteric nature is an embarrassment to Confucian scholars, who rightly insist upon the master's strictly down-to-earth approach to philosophy. Yet there is no denying that Confucius spent many years of his life reading this book, and during his last years in Lu wrote an extensive commentary upon it. Far from pooh-poohing the I Ching's often fantastic contents, this commentary even includes instructions about how to use the work for divination purposes by throwing little sticks in the air and reading the patterns they form. On the face of it, this seems as likely as discovering that Hegel was a closet ballet dancer, but even philosophers must have their hobbies, and throwing little sticks in the air to find out who's going to win the 2:30 race at Shanghai seems harmless enough to me. Confucius also spent his last years passing on the fundamentals of his philosophy to his disciples. As should be clear by now, this wasn't really a philosophy at all, not in the Western sense of the word. Confucius's teachings do contain references to epistemology, logic, metaphysics, and aesthetics, the traditional categories of philosophy, but they are only passing references and form no system. Confucius's teachings also pass comment on the taste for ginger and the length of nightgowns, without containing a comprehensive cuisine or theory of fashion. But judging from Confucius's period as minister of crime, it seems likely that he did have a very definite theory of fashion, so he might well have formulated comprehensive theories of cuisine and philosophy that have not come down to us. This Confucian learning and spiritual instruction was to form the basic education of the Mandarin class which ran the Chinese administration for more than 2 millennia. Like all such hierarchies, it eventually ossified. Confucius had foreseen the need to adapt to the times. The only ones who do not change are sages and idiots. But Confucius's warning was to no avail. Perhaps it is the fate of all civil services to be run by sages and idiots. In 479 BC, at the age of 72, Confucius lay on his deathbed. His disciples kept watch over him during his final illness. His last words were recorded by his favorite pupil, Tse Lu. The great mountain must crumble. The strong beam bursts. The wise man must wither away like a plant. Confucius was buried by his disciples in the city of Chufu by the Su River. The temple built on this site and the surrounding precincts were preserved as holy. For more than 2,000 years, this site was visited by a continuous stream of pilgrims. The recent hiatus in this tradition during the communist era is now apparently over, the end of a brief lapse in a venerable Chinese tradition established long before the birth of Socrates and Christ. Judging from Confucius's last words, he was well aware of his greatness, but uncertain that his message would long survive him. Confucius was quite right to have been worried on this score. Confucianism may have survived for nearly 2.5 millennia, but its resemblance to the original teachings of Confucius himself has sometimes been difficult to detect, much as it is difficult to relate the Inquisition and the burning of heretics to the message of the figure who delivered the Sermon on the Mount. But Confucius's message was not completely subverted by his followers. Just over 2 centuries after his death, the Han Dynasty established the first great age of Chinese culture. This dynasty was for the most part run according to Confucian principles, which proved so successful that the dynasty thrived for more than 400 years, outlasting most other Chinese empires and setting a cultural example which successive dynasties strove to emulate. In the West, Confucius was to be admired by Leibniz and his contemporary rationalist Voltaire, who declared, "I respect Confucius. He was the first man who did not receive divine inspiration." A trivial echo of Confucius's teaching is today found in the martial art of Kung Fu, which is named after the master, Kung Fu Tzu, but bears as much resemblance to its nominal origin as a Mars bar does to the planet. Similarly debased echoes of Confucius may be detected in the aberration in Chinese thinking that recently supplanted the teachings of the master. The personality cult of President Mao, the pilgrimage of the Communists' Long March, and the veneration of the Little Red Book, containing the sayings of Chairman Mao, bear an unmistakable resemblance to the cult that grew up around Confucius, which resulted in his portrait hanging in every classroom throughout China, his own long pilgrimage in search of a political job, and the veneration of the classic Sayings of Confucius. But all this probably wouldn't have bothered Confucius much. As he remarked, "I am different. I take life as it comes."